Hello, and welcome to our board panel discussion for the spring. We look forward to having you join us again in September when we have our next board panel discussion. Before moving on with our panel, I would like to introduce a special guest, Peter Roos. If you can stand up and wave. Peter is a former co-director of Meta, a public interest law firm with offices in California and Massachusetts, specializing in educational equity for immigrants particularly, and students of color generally. Prior to that, he was director of the education advocacy with MALDEF and counsel with a number of legal services programs. He was lead counsel in Plyler versus Doe and Goss versus Lopez, two very successful Supreme Court cases expanding educational access. He was lead counsel in a number of language access, school finance, desegregation, and immigrant access cases. He has been awarded an honorary Doctor of Humanities from the City University of New York, and he thinks he is currently in active retirement, but he is very much active in still being the civil rights activist person that he has always been. He just completed his memoir, and it's a memoir that puts together civil rights, education, legal issues, social justice, bilingual education, and a number of other very important issues that deal with social justice. So I'm very happy that we're associated with Peter, and we are very happy that we joined with him in producing his memoir, which if you're interested in purchasing, you can, right, Peter? Right. You can also get it through Amazon, and we will also be putting it online as a PDF file. So if you're interested in the book, you will be able to acquire it through a PDF as a PDF file at no cost in the very near future. So so thank you very much, Peter. Dr. Lourdes Ortega, Ms. Lourdes Ortega, who has joined us. Who has joined us because she's a member of our Board of Trustees, and she also has been a kind of a co-planner for this session because we planned this panel jointly with the Georgetown University and the Linguistic Roundtable, and we probably have some guests here, Lourdes, from that we're going to attend the conference.
Thank you, Joel. Welcome, everyone. I just wanted to briefly say welcome to especially those of you who are here presentially, physically, very few of you who were planning to come to the Georgetown Roundtable for Languages and Linguistics, GERT, starting tomorrow and over the weekend. We were very, very sorry that we had to cancel. We are very happy to have a few of you here presentially, and we welcome a lot of other people from GERT who are now participating virtually. I think we have almost 300 people total who are participating virtually right now with us. So thank you very much. Sorry, we couldn't do the conference, but put your presentations up virtually and share your research. Thank you very much. And I'm going to pass it on to the moderator of this panel. Roberta Miceli is Senior Director at Cal and a wonderful moderator. I've seen her in action many times. I have great faith in her powers to get our three speakers to tell us a lot of interesting things today.
The topic of this panel discussion today is the hegemony of monoglossic ideologies in the United States educational system. We have brought together thought leaders to talk about the very important reality of the fact that right now, English is the dominant language in U.S. classrooms. That is an undisputed fact. The impact of that on the multilingual, multicultural learner. First of all, we have one of our speakers who is joining us virtually. We have Nelson Flores, who is an Associate Professor at the
Hello.
Secondly, have Shondel Nero, who is one of our Cal Board of Trustee members. And Shondel is also a professor in language education and the director of multilingual, multicultural studies at New York University. And we are also extremely lucky and fortunate to have our very own Cal research scientist, Igone Arteagoitia. Igone. Thank you. All right, so our first question today for our speakers is for them to give us a brief synopsis of their background and then of the reasons why they have chosen to pursue the field of multicultural, multilingual education. And we're going to turn to Nelson first so that we can make sure that he feels as much a part of this discussion as the people here on the stage. Nelson?
Yeah, sorry again that I couldn't be there. I feel very, very bad, but you know, it is what it is, I suppose. And so, I mean, I grew up in a bilingual home. My mother is from Puerto Rico. My father was from Ecuador. And so from a young age, I think I already had a unique perspective on bilingualism and multilingualism in the United States as someone who grew up in a bilingual home rather than in a monolingual home. But I think what really got me kind of more interested in studying and researching bilingualism was my experience as an ESL teacher after graduating from college. So I taught ESL in the Bronx for, I guess, 5 years. And most of my students actually had been born in the United States and had been educated in the United States. But they were in high school and they were still officially classified as English learners. I came to find out that New York State referred to these students as long-term English learners, and found myself using a lot of deficit frames to make sense of their language practices. Deficit frames that I think were made available to me through some of the scholarly literature that I had read on the topic. But I quickly felt a disconnect between these deficit frames and what I saw my students doing on a daily basis. Right? These were students who engaged in English and Spanish, both in oral and written language on a daily basis. And yet I found myself describing them as not adequately bilingual and adequately biliterate. And I quickly became uncomfortable with that framing. And so that was originally what got me interested in studying issues of bilingualism. And then I guess I will talk more about my actual research when we get to the next questions.
Sounds great. Thank you very much, Nelson. Shondel?
Okay, so I was born and raised in Guyana, which is on the northern coast of South America. It's a former British colony, for those who may not know where Guyana is. And so I grew up in, I would call it a sort of a spectrum of bidialectal home, if you will. English is the official language because it was a former British colony, but my mother was a very sort of creolized English speaker, still is, she's still alive. And my father was a very sort of British colonial speaker. So I grew up with this spectrum of Englishes in my household. It was very rich and colorful. And my high school education was a very sort of British colonial model. And then we fast forward to my moving to North America. I did undergrad in Canada, majored in French and Spanish, so I had an early passion for language. And what really got me to start to think of bilingualism was while I was doing my doctoral work at Teachers College, I was teaching an ESL writing class at the college level at Long Island University in Brooklyn. And in my ESL writing class, there was a young man from, guess where? Guyana, where I'm from, this supposedly English-speaking country. So why is a young man from Guyana in my ESL class? And so that says to me that his English was constructed as non-native, hence he was in ESL class. And turns out that many other students from the Anglophone or officially English-speaking Caribbean were placed in ESL classes at that time. This was in the 90s. And so that started to raise questions for me because many of the students were actually upset about their placement in an ESL class. And this would be true for students coming from other countries where English is official, like West African countries, Nigeria, Ghana, and so forth, India. And so I started to question this whole construct of nativeness. Who is a native speaker? Who gets to decide that? And the field of TESOL is premised on the notion of a clearly defined native speaker and a supposedly understood non-native speaker. And so a lot of the research on that was raised in sociolinguistics long preceding me in African American vernacular English and so forth. However, students that were Creole English speakers were often not in the literature within TESOL or bilingualism. They were in the literature of Creole linguistics and so forth. So that really asked me to think about research and also helping teachers understand what do we do with speakers, thinking about our placement practices for those who self-identify as speakers of English, but the schooling system categorizes them in a different way. And so is their Creole English a language or a dialect? If we think of it as a language, what does that mean? So it challenged all of the constructs of bilingualism and multilingualism as we think about speakers whose daily practices involve a range of Englishes, and that might even include Tex-Mex on the border with Mexico. And how can research address these questions of nativeness, of diversity within English, of bilingual practices that include varieties, and how might we help teachers to teach students and assess them equitably with that level of diversity in their language. So I'll stop.
Yes, so for me also bilingualism was part of, was part of me from the very beginning, pretty much. Even though I grew up in a monolingual household, Spanish was the language of our home. I attended what was back then a clandestine bilingual school in the Basque Country in Spain during the last few years of Franco's dictatorship. And for those of you who may not know about or may not be familiar with recent, semi-recent 20th century Spanish history, Spain had a dictatorship for almost 40 years, from 39 right after the Civil War to 75. And one of the main goals of the dictator was to create one language, one nation, and one culture, when the reality was quite different. We had multiple languages and cultural traditions, and in particular, in my case, we had the Basque language, which happened to be my father's family's language. Unfortunately for him and his siblings, he grew up in the, he was born in the early 30s, so he grew up during those, main years of the dictatorship when speaking Basque in public spaces was banned. Definitely there was no such thing as learning Basque in school. And there was also this idea that Basque was the language of the uneducated, of the aldeanos, and many families chose not to pass it on, even in the intimacy of the house. So that was my father's situation. So luckily for me and most of my siblings, my older brother was too old for this, but for us in the 60s, in the mid 60s, this movement of Basque schools, ikastolas, that's the Basque for school, started popping up in neighborhoods. My neighborhood, one of them, and my parents, especially my mom, interestingly, thought that it was very important for us to regain the family language. So this school, which started, it was a small group of kids, one teacher in somebody's living room. When it got too big for that, we were moved to the underground of a church a local church in my neighborhood that let us use their facilities, and we became the Colegio Parroquial de la Pasión del Señor, which is Spanish Catholic name. The school was not Spanish. All of the instruction was delivered through Basque, except for we did have Spanish language hours, and it wasn't Catholic. And once a year, somebody from the Ministry of Education would come and make sure that everything was in order. And this teacher somehow knew when this person was coming and was able to train us to prepare us for not speaking Basque, hiding any material. We didn't really have textbooks in Basque, but hiding any materials that we had created that were in Basque. And so you can imagine how terrifying that an experience like that could have been for children. However, I really have fond memories of those years. And I was in that school from 1st grade through 8th grade. And I have fond memories on why we had amazing teachers that were willing to risk their jobs to go and protest in the French Basque Country. Like one day we got to school and half of the teachers were gone. Where are they? Well, they've gone to France to protest, to end the ban of bilingual education. So, I mean, this had a huge impact on my life, as you can imagine. And then, then English came into my life just through, world language program in the U.S., and I decided to major in English. And then I came to the U.S. and to study linguistics, and here we are in the Center for Applied Linguistics. But also, just one more thing, and I know I'm taking a lot of time, but I do have a son who went through a dual language program here in the U.S. So when I compare my experience with his, there are many differences. Definitely, I mean, the families and the students that I grew up with in this school it was a pretty homogeneous group. We were all white. We were all, pretty much working class, but more or less the same class. And, here, in the U.S., there are programs. For example, I'm going to talk about my son's, in which it's a two-way program. You have, and this is very grossly, like 2 main groups of native speakers of the partner language. In this case was Spanish, and then English, that there are differences, many demographic differences between them, ethnic and socioeconomic. And even though, there are some differences, I also was able to find some commonalities between the two experiences. The experience that my son had and the experience that not just him, but his friends, a lot of the Spanish-speaking Latino kids, that were, again, this is your typical two-way program that started out in a neighborhood that was primarily Latino, and over the years, it has been hugely gentrified. So, by the time my son was in school, they had to recruit students from other parts, less affluent parts of the city for the Spanish-speaking students. And and these students still, when I see them now, they're in their early 20s. Many of them have still those good memories from the school, though, like they remember the program with a lot of cariño. So it's interesting that, 2 totally different countries, and also generations and all that, but there is some commonality there in some of the, I'm not saying that this is, by any chance, representative of all of the dual language programs out there, but that's my experiences. You asked me about my experience, so. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. So 3 speakers, 3 thought leaders in this area with 3 very different experiences, but yet all questioning the dominant language and the impact that has on the other speakers. So now we're going to turn it back to Nelson, and Nelson, what I'd like to ask you about is one of your recent publications in the Modern Language Journal with Jonathan Rosa, where you are comparing Princess Charlotte's bilingualism with how English learners are compared in the United States. And you and Jonathan note that Princess Charlotte's bilingualism is touted as a very privileged idea, whereas some of the English learners in the United States are referred to as having challenges. Can you elaborate on that and help us make the connections?
Yeah, so shout out to Jonathan, who sent me a text saying that he's on the virtual thing. Hey.
Great.
Um,
Hello, Jonathan.
But so I think I would like to kind of take a bird's eye view first to answer that question and kind of think about the historical context in which the work that I do is situated. And so kind of taking it kind of further back to kind of the immediate of Princess Charlotte, thinking about kind of the historical origins of racism as connected to capitalism, right? That capitalism could not exist without racism. And it can exist without racism. And language ideologies were a key mechanism that were used to produce this racialization. And so when we look at the representations of the language practices of indigenous peoples and racialized peoples around the world, European colonizers would always call into question their language practices and suggest that something about their language practices made them less human than Europeans. And that discourse gradually shifts towards, rather than being less human, to being kind of less evolved humans, right? And my argument is that we've inherited that legacy in the ways that we talk about the language practices of racialized communities today. And so there are particular models of personhood that are connected to racialized communities that call into question their language practices. And Jonathan calls this the discourses of languagelessness that suggests that racialized communities don't have any legitimate language. Be them monolingual or bilingual, multilingual communities, the question is, there's a question that's raised about the legitimacy of those language practices, which then shapes the institutional listening subject positions of educators who work with these students, right? And my analysis is never about individual educators. It's about the institutions that educators inhabit that have inherited this deficit perspective that teachers are then expected to navigate in their work with students. And that's a lot of my work, is really thinking through how teachers interact with students within this broader history of colonialism that shapes their interactions with students today. And so what I would say is that teachers and others can work to challenge the listening subject positions by working to inhabit new listening subject positions, right? And so the example of Princess Charlotte, I think, is a good one, and it's one that I've used with teachers before, and I found it to be very productive because I think it resonates with them. They see that and they realize how the institutions they work in have a completely different way of describing the bilingualism of their students. And so I think it's a very powerful example. I mean, the one headline that I like to share is about how she started nursery school already bilingual. And I like to say, well, so many of our students start nursery school already bilingual, and that's framed as a problem, right? That's framed as something that needs to be overcome. And this is not in any way meant to not value the bilingualism of Princess Charlotte, right? I'm sure she's lovely. It's nothing about Princess Charlotte as an individual. But my argument is that we should be treating the bilingualism of all students, all children, the ways that people are treating the bilingualism of Princess Charlotte. And that's kind of my why we use that example, why I think it's a good one.
Thank you. And full disclosure to both you and Jonathan, when Joel and Lourdes asked me to serve as a facilitator, I started following you both on Twitter. And if you want to get a peek into their brains, I would say, and maybe that's not fair, Nelson. I know you'll let me know if I'm not being fair, and Jonathan can also do so in the questions. Your Twitter feed really helped me unpack your articles, I think, and be able to understand at a little deeper level. So shout out to both of their Twitter feed if you are interested in more details. They are very prolific on Twitter. Nelson, just one other follow-up question. So, and you already know, full disclosure, I've been following you on Twitter as well as Jonathan. And as I was doing that, I was reflecting on this article and the question today. So in my mind, it boiled down to the idea of social class. Am I being too naive? Correct me if I'm being too naive and I'm not fairly thinking about this.
Well, I mean, I don't think that that's a naive question. I think social class certainly has a part in determining how the language practices of racialized peoples and other people are perceived. But what I would add is that I think we have many examples of people who have been socially mobile from racialized communities whose language practices are also policed in ways that are different than white people from their same social class. And I think in academia, one of the obvious examples that I can think of is the kind of stereotype of the angry Black woman, right? And how Black women are heard to be angry for saying things that maybe if a white man in the academic space said wouldn't be heard as angry at all. Maybe would be heard as like brave or heard as like someone who's just speaking their mind. And so I think that race is, for me, a variable that certainly interacts with social class, but I think it has its own independent impact on people's lives that I think can be disentangled from social class sometimes, even as social class and race intersect a lot, especially in the US context.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, Shondel, let's turn to you. You have recently co-authored a book with Dora Ahmed, Vernaculars in the Classroom, Paradoxes, Pedagogy, and Possibilities. Correct? Did I get that right?
No, you got it right.
All right.
All right,
Okay,
yes.
phew. And in that book, you talk about the use of vernacular in the classroom and how vernacular is seen as less than, if I've interpreted that correctly. Can you elaborate more on that and talk to us about perhaps how teachers, educators, researchers can look at that from a different lens?
Well, I think the idea of vernacular as lesser ties into this larger ideology that Nelson raised. And that comes out of, I came out of a post-colonial context. And speaking to Nelson's point, in his research, he talks about the white listening subject. And what's really pernicious about the colonial legacy is that white listening subjects has now come the Black listening subject listening like a white listening subject. So that the internalization of the stigmatization of vernacular is perpetuated by vernacular speakers themselves. That's how deep the colonial legacy is. So that whites are no longer in these post-colonial nations, but the ideology of stigmatizing the vernacular has been internalized. So speakers see themselves as speaking, let's say, bad English or bad French instead of Creole. And so that's what we're working against. So the ideology is perpetuated by teachers of color who have internalized the idea of only one standardized form of the language counts as the language. And so in our book, we're starting with a presumption that everyone has a vernacular. The vernacular is simply, right, everyday mother tongue speech. And so I think that the language attitudes that are deeply entrenched that have made vernaculars come to be so stigmatized came out of, you know, going back 2 centuries ago, industrialization, when we were creating nation states, and the idea that one language equal one state, and unifying a nation state by a language, and specifically the standardized form of that language, so that anything else on the spectrum doesn't count. And so that's the ideology which got tied into race and class, and by the way, in the US, race is a class. So I think that that ideology and those deeply entrenched attitudes are really what is really difficult, because institutionally, standardized language is rewarded and privileges at every level of the society. So when I say let's bring the vernacular in the classroom and actually engage it and make it an object of study, that takes an attitude shift, because that now requires the teacher to be comfortable with that. And to, in the book, we argue that the vernacular can serve lots of educational linguistic purposes if we frame it as something that everyone has, and if we confront head-on the ideology that made vernacular stigmatized. And that affects assessment, that affects our teaching. Most assessment is done on standardized forms of the language only. So to validate vernaculars, we're challenging assessment people. We're challenging the speakers themselves. We're challenging 200 years of nation-state language ideology, monoglossic, in the sense that only the standardized form. So the speakers of vernaculars are stigmatized, and so the work to start to undo that has to be at every level, not just in the classroom, but language education policies. But I think when I go into schools in New York and do workshops with teachers, the first 3 sessions are just dealing with deeply entrenched language attitudes before we do any kind of actual classroom activity, because underlying our practices are our values and how we think about language. So in the book, we say 5 good reasons why the vernacular are being engaged, and we do it through literature, because literature in the academy is a kind of a safe space for the vernacular, because creative writers use vernacular and it's okay. But once it's outside of creative writing or humor, then there's this sort of barrier. So the book sees literature as an entry point to talk about the vernacular, to get people in uncomfortable spaces, to confront the ideologies, why it's stigmatized. And students have a lot to say. Students have a lot of opinions about language if we give them the space in the classroom. Because guess what? Everyone has language. Everyone has a dialect. So I think that the idea of engaging vernaculars in the classroom is to also take on the standardized language ideologies, how it came about, why is it that we're always putting the burden on the vernacular speaker to make the adjustment and not the other way around. So if we're going to engage language ideologies, I think the vernacular is the place to start, because it puts everyone to confront that uncomfortable zone of what counts as language, which often is only the standardized variety. And by the way, in my teacher education program at NYU, that's a very strong value, because we also train world language teachers. And so this goes beyond Spanish is not only standardized Spanish. French is not only Parisian French. And so that is often a very uncomfortable place, because we have been so socialized into one language, one nation state, and only standardized forms of language. So I'll stop there.
So Shondel, one follow-up question with that, if I may. So in your teacher education classes, when you start to talk about this, can you give some examples of how teachers have been able to either become aware of their attitudes and or become aware and start to move into the space that you're suggesting?
Often I start with getting to why is this uncomfortable? Where to sort of get to how they were raised with their own language attitude. So often we might start with a linguistic autobiography to start to go back to what were the kinds of things and how was language talked about in their lives and continue to be. And often it's a remarkable similarity of this ideology across languages. It's not unique to English. People grew up in Spanish-speaking households, and that's why we have the Mexican looking down on the Puerto Rican and the Puerto Rican looking down on the Dominican Spanish and that kind of stuff. So remarkably, these ideologies are across the languages because they go back to the industrialization and colonization of the world. So when we talk about it, that this is not unique to English, suddenly everybody has buy-in, because then we see it's happening with Mandarin, and it's happening with Basque and Spanish, and it's happening with Haitian Creole and French and all the various Spanishes and Tex-Mex. And so the entry point is to see how this was crafted across the world, this ideology, and to say if you're going to confront it, you're going to have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And then we start to do activities perhaps with the students, which they love, you know, actually doing vernacular detective work in their communities and seeing how they can bring it in to talk about language in the classroom. It also raises a lot of metalinguistic awareness too, which is good for teachers and students.
Right, great, thank you. Igone, I know you were nodding. Did you want to add something?
No, I was thinking that, you know, I totally agree with everything you were saying, but I think in addition to that, actually for some teachers, when they hear that it's actually okay to use their own language varieties in the classroom with their students and to allow them to, you know, to not only allow them, but validate whatever linguistic, you know, varieties they are bringing from home or from their communities, that it's actually for the teachers like, really? I can do that? Oh, you know? Or that they can use, you know, because many of them grew up with two languages at the same time, two languages in contact. So to allow them to, you know, to use the two languages in the classroom, that it is okay, that there are spaces actually for that, and that, you know, that's a really good way of, you know, building that metalinguistic awareness in the students. So I totally agree, but I think it's also sometimes very, you know, comforting to teachers.
Okay, now we're going to go back to Nelson. And Nelson, we're going to talk about another article that you wrote where you talk about challenging ratio-linguistic ideologies in research and practice. And in this article, you're providing some examples of Latinx student conversations, I believe, from an elementary school where you're doing some research. Can you elaborate on what you're finding and what the implications are for the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, I think first, I think everything that was just said, I think really resonates with me and the work that I'm doing. And I think that kind of taking just a step back, because I do that a lot, taking a step back from the question before actually answering the question.
Sure, okay.
All
right.
I think that really, I think I'm beginning from the perspective that language is not an entity that one has or doesn't have, right? It's a social practice that we engage in, and there's been generations of scholars who have inspired my thinking on that work, right? But this means that any social interaction is linguistically rich and complex, right? Because it's engaged in rich and complex social practices. And so perceptions that some are more rich and more complex are just that, right? They're perceptions. And they're based on one's own experience, and they're also based on one's institutional listening subject position. So I can give a concrete example. My nephews play video games. Half the time when they're talking about video games, I have no idea what they're talking about. So from my experience, it actually is quite complex because I don't have the background to understand the practices that they're engaged in. Now we could imagine if the world were organized around video game privilege, I would all of a sudden not be a very intelligent person, right? But we do this kind of reification, we as a field, not we as any necessarily individuals, when we talk about academic language as if it's somehow dichotomous with or separate from the language practices that students come in with. And there's often this dichotomy that I was responding to in that piece about academic versus non-academic, but also oftentimes talked about as like playground language. And I always say anyone who's ever been on the playground looking at young children will tell you that there's nothing simple about the complex social interactions that happen on the playground. They require a lot of really nuanced understanding of social interaction, right? And so when we say, oh, playground language, that's something that kids learn in 1 to 3 years, but academic language takes 5 to 7, I don't know exactly what we're saying. Because I, as someone who always struggled on the playground as an introvert, I don't know what it means to learn that in 1 to 3 years, right? I don't think that that's necessarily how language actually works. It's not a skill that one masters. It's a practice that one engages in and continues to engage in, right? And so kind of from that point of entry, now I can actually directly answer the question, is that I was beginning from the perspective in that article that all children come in socialized into linguistically rich and complex language practices. And so it was my objective in that particular piece which was in theory into practice. So it was me really trying to think about what this means for practice, was to show how what, quote, academic standards are asking for students to do, which if we look at like the Common Core, Pennsylvania has the PA Core, which is similar. The things that they're asking for is the ability to manipulate language for specific purposes, reflect on how language choice shapes meaning and effect. These are things that children can already do. All children can already do these things. That's part of how we become socialized into language. But that raciolinguistic ideologies prevent institutional listening subject positions from recognizing this, right? And so in that piece, I was looking specifically at Latinx children growing up in bilingual communities, like the one that I was working in and the one that I grew up in. And it was trying to look at the unique affordances for understanding how language works in this context when they're kind of everyday crossing socially constructed language borders. And so I think some of the examples that I provided in that piece and in other things that I've done and with teachers that I work with is that they can make observations in English, right, about how language works. And one interaction that was observed by one of my students was whether the N word with an A at the end is a bad word or a term of endearment. And of course, this is a debate that adults haven't reached consensus on. But these were first graders at the time who already understood that this was a fraught term, right? This was a term that had controversy around it, and they were grappling with what it meant. And of course, this can also come through observations in Spanish, where one of the students objected to the teacher's use of amigos when there were girls in the class because they didn't feel like it was gender neutral. And again, adults are grappling with that same debate right now. And these are young children who already understand the nuances of this debate. Or it can be done across both languages. So there was a debate that we observed among children about how to say beans in Spanish, which was much more controversial than we expected it to be. Some were saying frijoles, some were saying habichuelas. And whenever I give that example to bilingual teachers, they end up fighting about whether it's frijoles or habichuelas, which kind of is not the point. But I think these are just examples that show that children already have a sophisticated understanding of how language works and are constantly exploring it. And in that piece, I was really trying to think about how we can use that existing knowledge rather than see it as a barrier to learning or something that's dichotomous with learning.
Thank you very much. Igone, let's turn back to you. Let's talk about your research that you've been doing and that I believe you're getting ready to publish in TESOL Quarterly. And you're studying dual language classrooms, and I think your research focuses on the trajectory of the students in those classes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and help us understand what are some of the implications for classrooms today?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about the research on the benefits or the positive effects of bilingual education on minoritized students, but I am going to say that a lot of the research has focused primarily on English outcomes without recognizing that these students have, speak another language and have abilities in another language from home, and that they are studying in the school. And this is also the case, at least in part, in dual language programs that have bilingualism and biliteracy as one of their main, goals or pillars that we call them. So in the article that my colleagues Shujin Yang and I have written for an issue of TESOL Quarterly on equity on dual language bilingual education, we argue that the fact that dual language programs and research are driven primarily by English outcomes contributes to inequity. We're only considering part of what the students can do in terms of linguistic ability. And that considering students or considering outcomes in the partner language would provide students who speak those partner languages, that partner language at home, with the opportunity to function at the ones holding the knowledge, or more of the knowledge than those who don't speak that partner language at home. at the same time putting, and we're talking about assessments here, and we're talking about standardized assessment, full disclosure, but that's what we actually are working with. This is secondary data analysis, but we were able to obtain data in both languages. So putting assessment in the partner language at the same level, making it count, as much as English. It's provides recognition to the language, and it also allows the students to show a broader range of what they can do with the language. And so I guess our argument is that when we're looking, you're looking at the language and literacy development of these students in the two languages, that you cannot do that without considering these linguistic inequities that you have, and linguistic inequities and beyond, in many of these dual language programs. And another important piece is we're looking at data longitudinally. So, the importance of looking at documenting growth. When you have student learning through two languages, their development is not going to look necessarily the same as a monolingual speaker of language A or language B. For one thing, you're going to have cross-linguistic manifestations at the minimum, and then the development, the rate of development might also look different. And I think this is something that teachers and administrators and parents don't always realize. So, many times, especially in the earlier grades, you're not necessarily going to have students that are on grade level in both languages, or maybe in either one of them. So that's another thing that we're another, I guess, area that we discuss in the article is the importance of, or that it's more informative to look at growth rather than status or grade level performance, and that not only more informative but also a more appropriate way of looking at outcomes. And those are the two main things. The only other thing to say that this is part of it's a small piece of a larger project that we're doing, trying to begin to document features of dual language education in programs that are doing a good job at serving all of their students. And this is the first. So we departed from data in the two languages, and we had to limit it, unfortunately, to Spanish and English. Even though the original pool was larger, but we didn't have. It's very hard to get partner language data in Spanish, let alone in other languages, especially longitudinally. So we're trying now. We're looking at we did visits in two of the schools that were selected through that, those data analysis of the student data in the two languages, and we're just looking to see what we can learn about, what they are doing, how they're doing it, to see if we can, replicate or at least adapt it to other programs with similar characteristics.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this panel discussion. My name is Alexa, and I'm from South Africa. I visited North Carolina a week ago, and this is based on hearsay, so I'd like you to correct me where I'm wrong, but I understood that there is either in North Carolina or in the States, it is illegal for teachers to teach in a language other than English. And I wonder how that would encourage or discourage the use or the openness to different vernaculars and appreciating learners' resources in a classroom situation.
First of all, thank you for your question. I can't say that I was aware that there was a law. Is North Carolina an English-only state? Does anyone know this?
Nelson, do you know?
No?
I don't know.
I don't know. But were that to be true, I can't say that I know that for sure, but that's exactly the problem we're talking about, right? So not only is that saying only one language is permissible, only one variety of that language is permissible. So that is the kind of policy that perpetuates this monoglossic, ideology. And we've had movements going back many years of English only versus bilingual, these policy battles. But I think that that environment obviously will not encourage multilingualism, multidialectalism, and do in fact prevent any kind of equitable education. So I think in a state like that, the first case would have to be taking on the policy itself. That doesn't mean that people are not engaging in multilingual practices despite the law. I mean, that's the thing. People use their language. Language practices have nothing to do with the official language of the country. The U.S. does not have the English, as far as I know, is not enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. It's dominant, right? And we walk around the United States, so the laws of education do not necessarily equate with people's day-to-day language practices. Canada is an officially bilingual country. Really, most Canadians are not using French and English in their daily practices. Most of the French is in the province of Quebec. So I think in North Carolina, for those, I think if that were true, that they're not allowed by law, thanks for making us aware of that, there should be a force to sort of challenge that. What do teachers do in the meantime? I suspect that depending on the teacher's values and how they feel about that, you probably may have some teachers engaging in monolingual practices and some in more multilingual practices, which is a problem because then you have these sort of inequities even perpetuated across classrooms, maybe even in the same school. So I think it has to start with challenging that policy precisely because kids who are multilingual, their knowledge base is not being allowed to be engaged. You're from South Africa, multilingual country with how many, 11 official languages? And I'm sure there are many, many more spoken. So I think that the hard work is to challenge the policies and then to develop two things, assessments and instructional practices that can deal with people's actual practices around multilingual education. And we have to resist, I think, this linguistic trade-off in which it's framed. You have to acquire the dominant language at the expense of, so that there's a socialization of a trade-off that somehow, and that goes even with identity. We have situations where black kids are told that they're quote-unquote talking white because they're using a certain kind of standardized language, and that's perpetuating this trade-off of identity that you have to sort of give up something to gain something. And that frame has to be forcibly rejected. But I think it starts with collectively challenging policies like that at every level, and also policymakers really getting sort of a retraining in how we think about language. And our colleagues, this is also a challenge for assessment because so much of assessment is based on very clearly understood constructs, and so we have to think now of both formative assessment in the classroom and also standardized assessment, which by definition is standardized, right? But thanks for bringing that to our attention, but I do think that policy, and it has been challenged in other states, English-only policy, so that would not be the first time that would be organized. But I suspect it has to start at the policy level in concert with what's happening in classrooms.
Thank you. Very interesting. This is Annick de Houwer. I'm a professor of language acquisition and multilingualism in Germany. And I just wanted to, because the previous question was about policies, and I just wanted to refer people here to the United Nations Conventions of Child Rights, which was ratified by most countries in the world, but as far as I know, not by the United States, but which does in its Article 29, Part 1, Division C, say that education of children should be directed at developing respect for the child's, for a lot of things that the children bring, their culture, which includes, of course, their language. And I think that maybe not everybody is really aware of that, but it's important to point that out, that that exists, that text, and that there is some kind of framework and that one could put it inside that framework. And I'm saying that because of my experience in Belgium, a small country which does have a absolutely monoglossic ideology and language laws that forbid teachers from using any other language than either Dutch or French or German. But where there has been an organization for young children, a semi-government supported organization, which used to be very much against early bilingualism. But then, you know, I don't know that it has anything to do with my own work, but in the 90s I spoke a lot to social workers and teachers in Belgium and mentioning the Convention of Child Rights. And now, since 2012, they've changed their policy. So their mission statement starts with, we have to follow the recommendations that follow from the Convention of Child Rights, and that means we have to also, in our own work with young families, we have to tell parents that using their own language is very important and necessary for the development of their child. So I'm wondering.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Shondel wants to add something.
Just to follow up to that, in my point about what laws are and what people actually do are very different. I had a Fulbright in Jamaica, and Jamaica is a officially English-speaking Caribbean island. And what I observed, I was in 3 classrooms for a year, and the teachers swore, I only speak English. But in my observation, the teachers were routinely switching to Creole and English at very specific reasons when they wanted to explain something difficult. So, and so teacher practice becomes which Kate Mencken and I agree call de facto policies. They're policies happening at the classroom level by teacher practice, because the teacher will be trying to reach the kid whichever way. If the teacher is monolingual, maybe they might ask another kid to help out. So despite the rule or the policy saying only English, when you actually sit in a classroom and observe, that is not what actually happens. There's a lot of translanguaging, a lot of non-monolingual practices despite policies, because teachers are on the ground and they do whatever they can to reach kids. So that's what I see versus what the policy says.
Earlier, Professor Flores spoke to comparing and contrasting Common Core standards to the language of students. I was curious if he or any of the other panelists have compared the language of students with the English language proficiency development standards, or if the panelists are aware of any others who have made that comparison, so that, excuse me while I scroll down here, so that those of us who are in states who have to use the ELPDS can cite their work as we advocate for our students' strengths.
So Nelson, since they specifically called you out at the beginning, let's turn it back to you first, and then we'll turn it to our other panelists.
So I don't know specific work on the English language development standards. What I can say is that I do know work that's looked at the alignment between the WIDA standards and the Common Core standards, and have found them to be fairly aligned to one another. And with my familiarity with those standards, the ELP standards, I can say that I think that they are assessing similar things or trying to emphasize similar things and are coming from a similar theory of language. And so I think that if you look at the Common Core and if you look at these ELP standards, I think you will see similar things that they're trying to emphasize. And I think whenever teachers can use standards to justify the work that they're doing in classrooms, I think that's a great thing because it provides them an extra resource. And so when I have created like unit plans that are aligned to translingual mentor texts, for example, and show that it's aligned to the standards, right? Because the standards are not monolingual, they get read monolingually, but you can read the standards from a multilingual perspective. And I think you could do the same with language development standards and really think about them from a multilingual perspective. Right. But I don't know if others on the panel have more experience with English language development standards.
Thank you. Shondel, Igone, and either of you?
My sense is too that they are highly correlated. The scores from an ELP assessment and the ELA Common Core standards assessments. And that's why I think when you disaggregate the data by, for example, English learner versus non-English learner, then what you're doing is the English learners are still working on their proficiency in English. So you're always comparing those who are and they're not gonna probably show, because the two assessments measure very similar skill. You're not gonna show them you're always going to have that gap. So some researchers now, what they are doing is they're including the former English learners together with the English learner data to look at EverL, what they call ever English learner versus, so that, using those kids that enter school as English learners, but they have exited before the standardized assessments, and that way is a more fair way of looking at the, when you disaggregate the data by subgroups like that.